Welcome to chapter 5, and in today's lesson what we're actually going to cover is how to create a majestic PCG environment that works with the Spline controller. And to start off, first thing is to download the European Beach, as well as we're going to use STF package, just like I described before. It's Packt Free Landscape Pro. Make sure you enable your water plugin, and then once you enable, restart it. So next thing what we're actually going to do in this case is to start working on our blueprint. So in this case what I'm going to do is to right click, create a PCG folder. And in this case I'm going to right click again inside PCG folder and create a new actor blueprint. I'm going to call it BP_forest. Open this. And what we're gonna first thing do is to add our components to this blueprint. So go and add PCG. Next thing is also add a spline. Also for those who creates a new project, always keep in mind to enable your PCG first. The project that comes with the GitHub repository already has the PCG component enabled, so don't you worry about it. But if you are starting from scratch, just make sure you always enable it. Come back to our blueprint. First things first, let's start adding some of the variables. So let's go click on this variable and let's add trees as well as grass. And what we want to do is to set these to float, both of them, and make sure they're all being public. Compile it. Another very major important thing is always make sure you set this to at least 1000 units, because if you leave it at 0 and we're gonna start working on PCG framework where we're going to add those and plug into our PCG nodes, then the spacing in between, if they are being left at 0, it will basically crash our engine, because all the meshes that are going to be generated are going to be infinitely generating next to each other. That's what's going to cause the crash. So make sure you always set at least more than 0. So preferably here, I'm going to go for 1000. And then as we go along with the exercise, we can always adjust those later while we're doing the exercise. So next thing what I want to do is to create a spline. So let's just go and select our first spline, that point here that comes with this example. So I'm going to hold left alt button and then use my left mouse button for the mouse and then start adding those spline points. And I have already created a few points. I'm very happy with the results I got. I'm just gonna go close it. Another option here you can also do is then right click and then create your spline generation panel, set it to circle, and that's how you do it. But because in this case I'm gonna use this how it's written in the book, so I'm gonna go back, create it, and then close our closed loop. Okay, we can then compile it, save it, and I'm drag and drop, so at least we have some ready. Make sure we go at least bigger here, so let's just start moving those points around the landscape here. I'm going to make sure I adjust them. So I expand them slightly from each other, so at least that a little sprite stays in the middle. That kind of gives us the anchor point of the positions of its actor itself. And next bit is to create 2 PCG graphs. So in this case, what I'm gonna do, under the actor blueprint here, I'm gonna right click and I'm gonna create 2 PCG graphs. So let me just do that. One I'm gonna call it forest. Next one I'm gonna call PCG foliage. First things first, let's start working with our PCG foliage. So what I'm gonna do is start adding the nodes here into our graph. Add get actor data, and what get actor data will do is we're gonna use the information of any actor that are positioned into this, in this case, landscape, and we'll feed in for the PCG network of nodes here. That means it will basically work with its PCG graph itself. So that means anything we plugged into this later into a spline controller that gonna come with the actor blueprint will work in collaboration with that actor data that it's been fed through it, the whole PCG framework here. So that means it will work with this PCG graph itself. Well, next thing I'm gonna do is add 2 spline samplers. Duplicate it once more. And I'm going to start going to our configuration here. So with those 2 selected, I'm actually going to change them here on the dimension. I'm going to set to interior so it works within its interior itself. And I'm set this to unbounded. I'm going to go connect that to our get actor data. And of course, keep in mind, because at least we are connected, but we still have to change a few settings here before we can move on. So once we have those two selected, those point filters here, I need to change from curve to spline. Next thing I'm going to do is also use another node, which is going to be called distance. So I'm going to plug this into first spline sampler goes as source, another one goes as target. So it follows the routinely that first goes into source and the second part goes into a target. Another thing I'm going to do is add transfer points to reshuffle the position of its points. And I'm going to also create another get actor data. And I'm going to add another spline sampler. And let me connect this together. And make sure, of course, change this spline sampler's target type to our spline. Another thing I'm going to do also set this to our interior. And I will explain in a bit why we're using another spline sample with get actor data here. So let me right click and search for another transfer points. Connect them together. And for this one, I am going to first set this our output here. So we are going to add some input into our output. So this position, I'm going to then add these two pins here. So let me just add them. And I'm going to change this to trees and grass. Now, of course, we're going to have to set up our allowed types with, in this case, points. And that goes for both. And let's try and connect this. One goes for trees and one for goes grass. So there you go. The part of this is that we have two separate nodes structured to work with. One's with trees and one's works with grass. That's why we kind of set it up in this kind of situation. So the point of doing this here is that a little bit of diversity. So when it, for example, when the tree is going to spawn, one's gonna get for the source and the one go target, and that means they will basically behave slightly different from each other. So another thing I want to make sure is that set up the get actor property. In this case, it's gonna be the variables we created in our, in this case, blueprint, and set up here inside the foliage. So right click and search for get actor property. Let me duplicate it once more. I'll set it up here. So this one goes for grass, this one goes for trees, and this one goes for grass. So in this case, what we're trying to do now is to make sure it works with one of the components, in this case, inputs that comes from Spline Sampler. So we're actually going to connect into our get actor property into, in this case, it's going to be, so let me just make it a little bit bigger. And we're going to connect this to our, let me just make it a bit bigger more. And we're going to connect this into interior sample spacing. And what interior sample spacing will do in this case, it will dictate the number of spaces that's going to be distanced from each other. So that gives a lot more space based on the number of units we have added into our variable. So I'm going to then move this back how it was. And we're just going to use only one spline sampler for this one. And I'm going to also do the same thing, but this time for grass. So I'm going to open this up. And I'm going to then add this to our interior sample spacing here. So I'm going to set it as it is. So I'm going to save that. And I'm actually going to first comment this. So it's a lot easier to identify what we're dealing with. So in this case, I will hit C key for comment, call it trees. And this will be our grass. Change the color. Save that. In this case now, we can save it. And let's go back to our follow with PCG graphs we have. And I'm going to open now this time forest. But this time what's so cool about it, you can actually drag and drop another PCG, in this case graphs, and turn them into subgraph. That's what we're actually going to do. So if I drag and drop into the space here, and I'm set it to subgraph node, and we'll create another input subgraph here. which we're going to use this for this example. And of course, we are going to then start adding our static mesh spawners. So right click, let's add static mesh spawner, duplicate it. And we're going to use this for, in this case, for our trees. So add some mesh entries. Let's add 2 more. In this case, I'm just going to use some of these examples. So I'm going to use the first one, just sm underscore European beach field underscore 1 pp. The other one will be sm underscore European beach underscore forest underscore 3 pp. So let's start adding grass as well for another one. So I'm gonna go to select this other static mesh spawner and then add click mesh entry, and I'm going to look for grass. And because this grass we are going to use it comes from the pack of the other assets that comes from the Landscape Pro. And I'm going to use this, in this case, a grass selection. And you can use any type of grass you want, but it just happens that in the book I have mentioned that I'm going to use this grass, so I'm going to stick with that. So we can now plug those to the tree and this to the grass. So now we can save that, and let's go back to our, in this case, blueprint forest. And let's go to our PCG component, and all I'm going to do, I'm going to use the PCG forest that we've created. So I'm going to go and look for PCG forest, and I'm going to use forest, and I'm going to compile this. Now we can just go and test out, see what it looks like on the screen. You might see at the moment it's not popping anything, and of course maybe because the values are a bit too big. So let me just set this to, let's say 600 or 60, a bit too much, 600. And now you start seeing things coming out of this, and at least for the trees. There's a bit of grass coming, that's okay, but at least let's make it a little bit more for grass. So let's say set it to, let's say 200. And let's just make it a little bigger in size, so then we can extend those points there and there. So because we already have enabled our water plugin, which is great because that's what we actually wanted to test this out. In this case, what I'm gonna do is go and look for the water river, which we're actually going to use it. Let's add the water river. So in this case, let's search for on the plus sign here, water. In this case, it's going to be water body river. And what's going to happen? I will literally add it to our landscape here. So as you may see, we got our water. I just moved it a bit upward, so it's a bit closer to the existing landscape itself. It's not too deep. So now, as you see, we're not getting any, in this case, interaction with our foliage. Which comes from the PCG. And the reason why, because we haven't really tagged it yet, and we don't really identify the reasons why we want to use this river for the PCG to be sort of interacting with. So what we want to try to do now is we are going to use our water, in this case, river body, and we're going to tag it. But we're going to create it in the separate, in this case, PCG graph. So let's go right click and add another PCG graph. I'm going to call PCG water. So I'm going to double click on this, and I'm going to create, in this case, we're not going to use actor, we're actually going to use Spline. And the reason why, because at the moment, this water plugin only works as a Spline component. So right click and search for get Spline data. And I'm going to then add another Spline sampler. And let's select the Spline sampler, change our in this case, settings from mode of subdivision into distance. I'll set this to unbound. And I'm going to now go select our get spline data here, and I'm going to change this to work with get all award actors. And that's where we're going to set up our tag. And our tag here will be our by class. But because we already know what we're dealing with in the scene, so this is going to be called water body river. So let's go search selection. And under selection, search for water body river. And with this one, we can go and add it to our spline sampler. And what we're actually going to do is to output it. So in this case, we are going to change our output to in this case, water. We're going to call it water, and we are actually going to make sure a lot type itself works with points. So now if I open this up, I'm going to plug this in, and I'm going to save this. Let's go back to our PCG forest framework. Let's add our PCG graph for the water. So in this case, I'm going to drag and drop, and let's go call a subgraph node. And to make sure that it works and interacts with our PCG foliage and together with static mesh spawners, what we need to do is to kind of make a difference between these static meshes, which are going not only be spawned, but we also don't want it to be on their way. So in this case, we want to remove them. So in order to remove these popping out static meshes that are blocking the water flow, what we're gonna do is to set up this difference node. So in this case, right click and search for difference node. And this will allow us to, in this case, makes the difference as the water can basically pass through without affecting other static meshes, where the static mesh will be literally removed as the water passes through the, in this case, forest. So I'm gonna make sure I'm gonna make this difference as our water, and I'm gonna set as our grass here as our source. And because I want that grass not be sort of fed through the foliage, we're actually gonna disable this. And actually, because we already have this as our source for our grass, where it's coming from, I'm actually going to then connect this to our static mesh spawner here, which will be our output for the difference node. I also want to make sure that our density function is set to binary. So now if I go and test this out, then you start seeing that Body River is able to swim through as it flows through the grass itself. That means grass gets removed. But of course, we still seeing the grass being sort of not properly dispersed, in other words, being removed properly, because we still have to set up some bounds that comes with the water flow. In other words, we want to make sure that there's a boundaries going, that as the river passes through this foliage here, the foliage also interactively gets, in other words, reduced by the time the water flows with a significant amount of grass itself. So we're gonna actually add this, and we're gonna introduce another node, which gonna be called bounce modifier. And that's where the bounce modifier becomes, in this case, integration that will help us to remove this excess amount of grass that comes up in this forest case. So I'm going to go back to forest, and I'm going to right click and search for bounce modifier. As you may notice, the bounce modifier is sort of similar to how PC difference does, but in this case, what it does, it removes the excess amount of this unnecessary foliage, in this case foliage or static mesh that spawns around the water itself. So I'm gonna use this as our kind of eraser, and I'm going to set this scale. As we have already settings to scale, let me just set at these values, which comes under a y-axis, to set, let's say, 4 and 4. Because you can also test it out to any other values. It's just, as you may notice, in this case, the water body rivers start to behave naturally now. So we can now test this out however we want to. And you can also try and see if you wanted to see what other difference it will make if you set this to add X value as well as Z value. But because Z value only works on the upward direction, so the wisest thing here is to use either Y on X direction. And you can test this out, of course. It doesn't do much on X, but at least this is like something that we know of. And we can test it out here again. As you may see, at Y value it started to kind of a bit more disappear, which is great because that's what actually we needed for that exercise. And we can repeat the same process with trees here as well. So literally we're gonna copy this formula that we already have, but in this case I'm gonna copy this one and paste it right on top. I'm going to disconnect it. I'm going to connect it here to our source. And I'm going to do the same thing, but in this case I'm going to connect a PCG water into a bounce modifier. And I'm going to go directly connect this to our trees here. So watch out what's going to happen. So I'm going to go back, and then you see it will literally do the same thing for the rest of that. So in this case, if I want to make it, let's say, bigger environment, so I'm going to go and just expand it slightly bigger. So at least you have a bit more control and a bit more volume to use it for this exercise. And I'm gonna make it a little bit more bigger. So as you now notice, we go literally a forest. So if I decide to change direction of our river, things start to take place, and I'm gonna go closer. Even if I change this position here, then all the other objects that comes with that, in this case foliage, it will just disappear, right? And let's do the same thing there too. And you can maybe even longer expand it as far as you want it to. So if I want to go further this way, then I can also add another extension of the foliage that is literally generated and expand it even further. Another thing I would like to add to this entire parts of this exercise, and I think it would be wisest thing to also add as an additional extension to this exercise, is change a little bit the formation of this foliage that is being spawned. As you may see, they seem to be working in like spawning literally as like a grid formation. In other words, being sort of spawned exactly in the same spot, but next to each other. So in this case, what I'm going to do is to reduce this problem by adding transfer points to each of these static mesh spawners being spawned. So in this case, it's a very simple thing to do. So what you need to do is just add typical node, as we call it, transfer points here. And to do this, I'm going to literally add this into our foliage. So let's go to our PCG foliage. And I'm going to expand a little bit more of that. So I'm going to then add transfer points here. I'm going to duplicate it. So we have it also for grass. I'm going to then connect this just like that. Maybe because if you have some issues with handling the... Okay, let me just first, let me just go and select PCG. I'm going to clean this up for now, so it doesn't take too much of our performance here. I'm going to set up absolute rotations for each, and just I'm gonna mix it up a bit. I'm going to, for the grass, I'm going to change this to this kind of values, -80 and 180 for minimum and max rotation. Set maybe offsets to -20. 20, the same thing here, 20, compile that. Maybe let's do some bit of for the trees as well. And you may as well do the same thing for the trees, of course, if you wanted to. It's entirely up to you. So if I go back and then literally regenerate what I've done, now as you may notice, the formation of the grass is a bit different here. It does look too pretty much attached in a way that it does look like it's spaced out in an equal formation. At least does look like it's a grid. It's slightly a bit different this time. So they're not as being in the one straight line in a row, but they're being sort of moved out from each other. And of course, if you want to make it perfect, then you can always increase the number of spacing between, but keep in mind that it's also going to add another power calculation that comes with that, because the closer they are, the more literally grasses will spawn in the smaller sections, which means within the 50 millimeter units. So that's why it's doing that. That was your exercise on chapter 5, and what you've just done, you have learned how you can work with an additional asset that comes with Unreal itself, like in this case water, body, river. And what you notice is how you can tag them so that every time you interact with any objects that comes with PCG, it will remove that as an obstacle within the difference node itself. Another thing what you also learn is how you can actually combine different PCG graphs within another PCG graph and cooperate them together so that they can have their own PCG graphs node settings. Connecting with an additional nodes that interacts with another PCG graphs as the subgraphs. So that was just an exercise for you to see what capabilities you may have and another additional skills you can get from using PCG. And the next chapter, which will be chapter 6, we're just gonna get into more cooler stuff using the auto landscape materials. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next chapter.